Hello and welcome to the Sunday Guardian show by Joyeeta Basu. I have a very special guest with me from the US, Cleo Paskal, who is a geopolitical analyst. Of course, she's with the FDD, Foundation for the Defense of Democracies in Washington, D.C. Apart from that, she also is a columnist with the Sunday Guardian. Welcome, Cleo, for the show. Nice to see you.
Always nice to see you, and good to chat a bit. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you. Today, Cleo and I, we are going to discuss, rather, Cleo will do the talking. I'll be asking the questions about what is happening with the elections in US. I mean, she's there, she knows what is going on. So, Cleo, what is this going on the Democratic field? We have some clarity on the Republicans, but what is happening on the Democratic field?
So I don't know if anybody knows what's going on, but from what I can tell, yeah. So obviously the presidential candidate has been replaced. So President Biden, as it currently stands, and things are changing quite quickly, will remain the president until the election. Vice President Kamala Harris will run for the presidential campaign opposite Donald Trump. She has yet to pick her vice presidential candidate. This is a very unusual, if not unprecedented, situation. Normally, the candidates for president are chosen through a primary process where people vote. In the U.S., you're supposed to, when you register to vote, you either register Democrat, Republican, or Independent. And each state runs its own elections differently. Each of the 50 states, their elections are run differently. And part of that difference is the way they run what are called the primaries, which is where they select their candidate for the parties, select their candidate for the House or the Senate or for the presidential position. And so the Democratic Party has already gone through its primaries in the states in which the party members, the registered Democrat Party members in each of those states, has cast their vote for who they want to be the presidential candidate. And President Biden won that by about 95%. Any opposition was encouraged not to run against him. So he ran effectively unopposed across the country. Now, each of those states, then those parties, the Democratic Party in, for example, Iowa, will send its delegates to the convention, which is going to be coming up soon, the Democratic Party convention. And those delegates are supposed to vote in the way that reflects the way the primary voters decided. So if the Democratic primary voters in Iowa voted 95% for President Biden, then pretty much all of those delegate votes from Iowa are supposed to go to President Biden. And I can't remember the number. It's something like 16 million people voted in those Democratic primaries. And now they're being told their vote doesn't count. We're substituting the candidate at the last minute. The candidate is going to be Kamala Harris. The reason that they can't really change it to a totally different candidate is because a big war chest, a big amount of money was raised on that Biden-Harris ticket. And the money can't be transferred to somebody else other than Biden or Harris. So if a new person was brought in at the last minute, like Michelle Obama, for example, she wouldn't have access to that, whatever it is, 200 million, huge amount of money that was raised under Biden-Harris. So the Democratic Party kind of boxed itself into a corner by not addressing this issue of Biden's inability to run for a second term, by not giving the primary voters a choice to go for somebody else, and by locking themselves into this Biden-Harris path. So there will be this what they call an open primary, but I think it's open conference where theoretically people can vote for whoever they want. But I think that's likely primarily intended to make it look like Kamala Harris wasn't just anointed, that she had to fight for it a little bit in order to give some credibility to her campaign. But this has never really happened before. So it's uncharted territory, and I think that it's quite contentious for obvious reasons.
So very undemocratic act by the Democratic Party.
I think that's why you're starting to see reaction among Democratic some major groups within the Democrat who normally support Democratic causes, kind of wondering what's going on. But the Democratic Party machine is very strong and very effective, and they will line up to support their party. And they have a deep old ground game that's been in place for decades. And I think that, many of them think, that the candidate is almost secondary to the important party in the machine, which is how they seem to be okay with President Biden continuing until the debate made it very evident what the situation was.
So basically, they are all set to manufacture a consent.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting way of putting it. I think I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think that's probably fair. They might use discipline or that sort of term, but especially because the role of the media really needs some discussion on this. And of course, the term manufacturing consent is a Chomsky term, which came out around other issues. But in this case, as journalists, you and I both know it. If you had, it would be very difficult to be a White House press corps journalist and not be aware that there was an issue with the health of the president, if you were being honest with yourself. So the fact that it took the debate for the dam to break on this story is a little bit disconcerting as a journalist. I mean, I think there's been a real failure in coverage if this is really what it took. So there seems to have been some sort of manufacturing of compliance, if not consent, and it's very dangerous. It's very, especially in a democracy.
Kind of hiding his illness and then thinking you can get away with it. But for the debate, it would have we never know what would have happened. Now, tell me, before we start talking about Trump and J.D. Vance, what are the chances of Kamala Harris, beating Donald Trump? Because, at least the legacy media, they have already started flooding social media with ratings and opinion polls that are showing that Kamala Harris is ahead of Trump by 5, 6, 7 points and all. How much of this is the reality? What is the public saying?
So she'll get a bump from the honeymoon period. But she's consistently polled lower than Biden in a head-to-head with Trump. She hasn't been a popular candidate. I saw your very good interview with Professor Nalapat, and he's always right, but I think probably especially right on this, on the issue of the VP choice will be important. But there's two different questions, right? There's the question of popularity, and then there's the question of what will happen in the election. And there are still, I think if Indians understood how elections in some U.S. states are held, they would be raising their eyebrows about election security issues, right? So I think in one of the states, like I think it's Wisconsin, but I need to check. They've just allowed again these drop boxes where you can kind of it's like dropping your vote in a box on a street corner. I mean, it's supposed to be secure, but there were questions about it last time. There's early voting. There's I think again in one of the states they're allowing votes to come in 4 days after election day. There are all of these peculiarities that in many cases were brought in during COVID that whether or not they are abused, they just raise the question of the integrity of the electoral process, which is again, if you mention it, it's another issue within the media. I think a good journalist would just want to report on it, but it's seen as biased if you try to report on it. So a lot of it is kind of gets subsumed into that you're for us or against us type of ideology. I'm not an American. I don't vote in America, obviously, but there's so many things that are happening that, for example, this issue of people coming across the border. Okay, so I mean, there are millions of people who've come across the border. The way that the U.S. House of Representatives works, so there's the House and the Senate. The House of Representatives is apportioned based on population numbers. So if a state has, and these are totally fictional numbers, but it's just to give you an idea. If they have, say, 10 million people, they might have, 10 seats allocated to them in the House of Representatives. If they have 12 million people, then they might get 12 seats. Okay. Now, the way those people, that number of people, isn't number of Americans, it's the number of people who live there based on the census. And the census doesn't take citizenship into account. So if a whole bunch of new people move into, for example, a Democratic area, and that Democratic area then gets more seats, same for a Republican area, then that they get more representation in the House of Representatives. Okay. So once you start looking into sort of the nitty-gritty of these mechanisms of how the voting works, but also how seats are allocated, the Senate is different. Every state gets 2 senators, but the House of Representatives, you get these rejiggering, and sometimes can be very dodgy, both on the Republican side and the Democratic side. But this issue of numbers is a very big one. And it's taken, people like Elon Musk have brought it up. But it's not really being discussed in the context of what's happening on the border in the mainstream media. It's considered a kind of a fringe issue, even though it's just reporting on the straight facts of the situation. And, it could benefit the Republican side if you end up with a lot more people in Republican districts. But that all has to be looked into to see who is benefiting. And if this system actually is a viable, is representative democracy in a republic. The U.S. is a republic. So all of this to say, there are 2 different things. What the polls are, who looks popular, who looks ready to beat whom. And the other thing is what's happening in the mechanics on the electoral side.
How loony left is Kamala Harris?
So she's more. I think she's more complicated than that, and the complaint that she's a politician, and a highly adaptive politician, and the bigger complaint and or concern. And I would I would refer people to work by Peter Schweitzer, who wrote the very good book about Clinton Cash. And he has a podcast also, but he's written some very, very good detailed research on political families and leaders. And he's never been sued, which is always an indication that, that he's done his research. And one of the things he brings up is about her profile as a prosecutor in San Francisco, and who she chose to prosecute and who she didn't choose to prosecute. And one of the things that he brings up, for example, is she was a girlfriend. I mean, this is all on the record, of a very powerful Willie Brown, yeah. And when she became the Attorney General there, and so in a position to decide who to prosecute and who not to prosecute, some of the cases that were against people who had done business with Willie Brown were settled or dismissed or reduced, things like that. There's also concern over her choice not to go after the Catholic Church for abuse of children. So I think it's not, the track record is much more of a pretty typical politician who is, doing that kind of thing. And I would view whatever, we've all seen the YouTube videos of her talking about her pronouns or things like that. And that's a politician, playing to the audience that she's with. She's not stupid, and this path has been very successful for her, brought her up to the vice presidentship, and now she's the presidential candidate. But the question is, if she knows that part of that is the result of backing from certain groups, who is the Willie Brown behind, supporting her now?
Yeah. Because there's already some talk that she has the backing of George Soros. Now, that is something that's going to make a whole lot of countries very, very worried.
Oh, well, it's not talk. I mean, the son, Alex Soros, has said he's backing her. Yeah. So, I mean, that's on the record. And she raised an enormous amount of money in her first day and a half of fundraising, a huge amount of money. Yeah. So that's the situation.
Tell me, I know it's strange. She doesn't seem to be a candidate with much integrity. She will go whichever way her funders back her. Sorry, maybe she will turn out to be something completely different if she becomes president. But that is the impression that I am getting. But now
to be fair, we're talking about, the majority of politicians would be like that.
Now tell me a little bit about the Trump and Vance campaign. What is going on over there?
So the choice of Vance is a very smart choice. Vance, because we've covered it in the Sunday Guardian. He's relatively new as a senator. He came in 2022, and he has a background. He comes from a very poor family. His mother was addicted to drugs. He was raised by a grandmother. An area of the U.S. that's been really hard hit by the deindustrialization of America, in large part through Chinese trade policies. And so from that early era, he's very aware of how Chinese entropic warfare, functionally, has been destroying America from the inside through fentanyl, which killed about 70 million Americans last year. I mean, fentanyl alone killed more Americans last year than the whole Vietnam War did. So he's very aware of the cost of addiction to families, what it does. If you've got one addict, that affects their entire family, right? So it's not, might be 70,000 people who died, but there might be, 15 times more than that who are addicted, and every addict affects a family. So this is something that a lot of Americans can appreciate or can empathize with, and there's no work, which of course contributes to addiction as well in some cases, and that so he knows that both of those things track back to China. That's that era. Then he joined the Marines. And he was with the Marines for 4 years, so he has kind of an understanding of the concerns of the military. And then he if you join the U.S. military, you get money to go to university. He went to university. He got a law degree. He ended up at Yale, where he met his genius wife, Usha, and then they became a very tight team. He went into the business sector. So he's had, and including in high tech, so he's had a very broad range of experiences across American society. And he's young, he's under 40. And he positioned himself as a MAGA candidate during his primary for senator. So, for example, there was a debate about Ukraine these are the Republicans who all wanted to be the person to be chosen as the Republican candidate for senator. And he was the only one who was not for sending more money to Ukraine unmonitored. So that set him out very early on. And the question was whether the Republican establishment, who had a different opinion, if they would be able to knock him out of the primary. And Karl Rove, who's a very powerful political operative, was very against Vance. But he won the primary, and then he became a senator. And you can tell by the people who were within the Republican Party who were pushing against choosing Vance, like Karl Rove, how he is representative much more of the base and of the MAGA base and the Trumplicans, as opposed to the Republicans, the traditional establishment Republican Party. So Trump is basically in a position where he's 78 years old, and they need, if he wants to continue the Trumpian party, they need somebody who can carry that mantle. And to be very brutal, they needed somebody, the Trump campaign needed somebody that the establishment Republicans hated or were scared of even more than they were, or as much as they are, of Trump. So there's less of a desire to try to get rid of Trump. They get rid of Trump, now they're going to get Vance. So it becomes like an insurance policy from the Trump position. And, so it's, if you're a Trumplican, if you're a Trump Republican, which also includes a lot of independents, Trump is winning over a lot of the independents, then Vance is a very smart choice.
So what about the Republican base in general? Are they totally, say, for example, the mistakes that happened for the Republican Party in the 2020 elections, has Trump been able to overcome that? Will he be able to overcome that with Vance in the next election?
So it's a very unusual situation, because you now have a president. People know what their lives were like under Trump, and they can compare it to what their lives were like under Biden-Harris. So Harris is probably going to have to work very hard to rid herself of the Biden legacy, because if in the polls, the majority of people think their lives were better under Trump. The economy was getting better. There were no. It's funny. Kind of early on, I was sitting in a diner in Alexandria, and at another table there were 4 people, police officers and firemen, who were on a break, and they were just sitting there talking. And and they were talking about Biden versus Trump, and people, some were pro-Biden and some were pro-Trump. But the one guy, happened to be a black guy, just said, look, under Trump, gas prices were lower and there were no new wars. That was it. And that's it's all he wanted. He didn't want, the U.S. is having a very hard time under Biden getting people to join the U.S. military. Recruitment is very low. They don't trust this administration with the lives of their sons and daughters. A lot of people. I mean, you can just see it in recruitment. So you have this unusual situation where you have somebody with a track record running, and a lot of that's why you're seeing the shift in the Hispanic community. He's getting, for a Republican, very high numbers among Black voters. I mean, even if it's just 20% or something, that's very high for a Republican running for Black voters. So they're running. It's not so much what's happening now, like what they're saying in the campaign now. It's they're remembering their experience under the previous Trump administration and determining that life was better 4 years ago. It's that old Reagan line: "Are you better off now than you were 4 years ago?" And people are saying, "No, I'm not." I mean, enough people, and especially in categories that traditional Republicans normally don't win.
So basically, you see, I'm hearing that because it is Trump and because the Democrat voter hates him so much, there will be much more better mobilization on the part of the Democratic voter than on the Republican. Do you think that is going to be the case? That anyone but Trump is very strong?
Right. So there are what are called, when they're doing polling, there are called favorables and unfavorables. So how much does somebody hate somebody or like or love somebody, right? So Trump's favorables are bigger than his unfavorables. And there's some very strong unfavorables. Obviously, there's at least a 30% chunk of the American population who really hate Trump, and that's not going to budge. But there's some who just dislike. But overall, his favorables, like and really like, outweigh his strong dislike and don't particularly like. I'm waiting to see the numbers on Harris, but they're not great. She's never been particularly liked. So there will be, she doesn't have to be liked if you really hate the other guy, which is what you're saying. But that number is not a majority number from the polling that I'm seeing now.
I think we have to end it now, but from what I'm gathering from you, well, we are going to have a very interesting election season ahead. Let us see who Kamala Harris's vice president pick is, if the Democratic convention is hijacked or not, all these things, and how the voting actually takes place. A lot of these things will actually determine who the new president will be in November 2024. Thank you, Cleo, Thank you, Cleo, for giving me such a lovely interview. It's always a joy talking to you. I get to understand.
Thank you, and it is a really unsettled time. Anything could happen at this stage. So one of the candidates could say one thing, and things could just go off the rails. So we'll see. Like you said, thanks again.
Yeah, that's a good headline. Anything can happen.